Today we are at Shalom Memorial Funeral Home and Cemetery, and it's going to be a sad one today if you're an 80s kid like I am and Katie is. We're here to see the man who wrote and or directed and acted in most of our favorite movies of our lifetime. Let's go see Harold Ramis. Daze with Jordan the Lion begins now. He is all the way to the back. A very peaceful place. Harold was born and raised here in Chicago, and his family was Jewish, and this is a Jewish cemetery, but he didn't ever really identify as Jewish. If anything, he kind of considered himself more Buddhist than anything. I think his wife was the one that selected this final resting place. So Harold is all the way back here, and I was curious because it's a really big cemetery, so it's kind of hard to find people. So I went to the office yesterday and they told me they knew exactly where it was because the guy had planned the arrangements and everything, and I said, was this a place that Harold chose or his wife? And he said that it was his wife. So I always wonder about that, if people, because Harold's death was, I don't want to say it wasn't foreseen, but it was untimely in a way because he was so young. But he had basically got an autoimmune disease at one point that left him unable to walk. Then when he recovered from it, he had a relapse from it, and then eventually ended up passing away in 2014. God, was he funny. So good. Son, brother, husband, father, friend, teacher, student, creative force, generous spirit, lover of life, and loved by all. Pretty much sums it up, doesn't it, Katie?
It really does. I mean, you are fans of more work that he's had his hands on than what any of you even realize. Stemming all the way back to his days with SCTV. Being a writer for Saturday Night Live. Huge impact on the National Lampoon's magazine and movies in general. Yeah. He started performing at an early age. He said he loved movies as a kid. So he said he always loved the most Cary Grant and Errol Flynn, but he saw himself as kind of a mixture of Groucho Marx and Harpo Marx. He always liked to be the funny guy. And so he said he started learning guitar when he was a teenager and would do shows and would get in little theater performances. And then eventually went off to college, and one of his first jobs was actually working in an insane asylum, which he said was really good training for his future in Hollywood. But he ended up basically going to Second City to train, and then was replaced by John Belushi. And then he called up Playboy magazine one day and told him he was looking for a job and that he had written several articles and they were looking for a comedy editor. So they just gave him like a stack of jokes and told him to edit the jokes, and that became his job. He got started there. Then he was working on, he went back with Second City, started doing SCTV, and he said the first time that he actually met Bill Murray was because he was in class with Bill's older brother Brian Doyle Murray, a legend who Harold would co-write Caddyshack with. But he said one day, Brian said, why don't you come up and meet my family and have dinner with us and everything. So he said we were going to drive up there, and he said on the way we'll pick up my brother Bill. And he said we picked him up at some golf course in Willamette working the 9th hole concession stand. Then he said I didn't see him again for about 6 months when I saw him across the street from Second City, a chestnut salesman. He was selling like roasted chestnuts in front of Treasure Island, and he said he was the funniest chestnut salesman he'd ever seen. So eventually John Belushi started working with Harold, and they all started doing, well, basically John got him hired with the National Lampoon Radio Hour. He got Gilda and Bill Murray and
Harold Ramis, and they started doing something called Lemmings, and Harold ended up getting his big break by getting to co-write one of the biggest movies of all time, definitely the biggest movie of its day, National Lampoon's Animal House. He said he actually wrote it himself as Otter. He always saw himself as that, but they didn't want to put him in stuff. They just saw him as a writer. He was a really good comedic writer. He ended up doing that. Then he wrote Meatballs, that they wrote with Bill Murray in mind, kept pitching it, trying to get Bill Murray to agree to do it. And Bill's agent kept saying, no, Bill just wants to go to minor league baseball games all summer. He doesn't want to work. And they kept hitting him up, and then he'd say, well, Bill will consider it. And then literally the day before they were supposed to start filming, they got the okay from Bill's manager that Bill was coming and that he would be there. He showed up in that Hawaiian shirt that we see in the movie and said, this is going to be my costume, and that's it. Didn't know any of the lines. He would read each scene before they would do it, throw the script aside, and said, I got this. And that would be one of, I believe, 6 times that Harold and Bill would work together throughout their career. Of course, he then went on, at one point, John Milius had asked Harold to write and work on 1941, but they had a difference of opinion, so he left that. He wrote Caddyshack. He ended up eventually doing Ghostbusters with Dan Aykroyd. Got his foot in the door acting. He wrote Stripes. I mean, the guy's talent was freaking endless. And he would say, when people would say, do you consider yourself a writer or an actor? He said, oh, it depends on what I've done recently. If I wrote something and it was a bomb, then I call myself an actor. And if I was an actor and it was a bomb, I call myself a writer. He said, whatever you were most successful at last, that's what you want to tell people. So it was very likable. Most of his early movies, in fact, Stripes, they always had something to do with something out of his real life. And he was actually a draft dodger. When he was supposed to report, he pretended to be homosexual and showed up on drugs, and they threw him out. And so he used some of those experiences for Stripes and went on to have an amazing career. The early movies would always be about bucking the system, or, you know, overthrowing the kind of the authority figure. But then later on in life, you know, I said he kind of became Buddhist. That became kind of a central figure to his movies, where everything was about someone who wasn't getting the most out of life having a realization, almost like that, you know, Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life moment, where they realize that the whole point of life they're missing. And so Groundhog Day is actually one of those that I think is the best at that. And it was a pretty horrible experience for everyone involved. Katie, I know you love the movie, but had you heard that as well, that they quit talking after this movie? For as close of friends they were making Ghostbusters, Ghostbusters 2 and all that, they quit talking after this movie.
It's crazy to think, because if you see them kind of behind the scenes and on movies, those two were just guys that you thought just were kind of like yin and yang, like they just always worked. And here it was 20 years after Groundhog's Day. It wasn't until Harold was on his deathbed that Bill finally came out and made it out there. And hopefully they were able to kind of make amends, even though Harold had lost the ability to speak and obviously move. I hope that was something where they could both kind of find peace.
Yeah, you're right. Brian Doyle Murray, Bill's older brother, was the one that told him that Harold was passing away basically on his deathbed, and told him he should come make amends after 20 years. Mm-hmm. What it was, you know, I found an interview with Harold where he said, you know, I had this idea. The writer had written this script, and we thought, you know, Bill's perfect for this. So we told Bill, and they said, yeah, Bill wants to have a meeting. And so we met up at a restaurant, and he said, we talked about everything under the sun except for the movie. And then he walked us out to his car, got in his car, rolled his window down, and said, I like it, I want to do the movie. We hadn't even talked about the movie, and he said, and then he just sped off. So he said, what I didn't know was that Bill had befriended the writer, and then had the writer come out and visit him, I think in New York. Basically ended up talking the guy into moving in with them, and they would work on the script every day for a month, rewriting the script. So during all this was pre-production, where Harold Ramis is in Woodstock, Illinois, building sets and working the final details out on the script, organizing everything. And then all of a sudden they show up to film the movie, and Bill has a completely different movie that he wants to film. And Bill was kind of known for being difficult to work with, and this was no exception. Even with Harold, he would not budge. And Harold said it got to a point where, you know, we were having daily screaming matches, or someone would be screaming at someone else, and it was really torture. He said, I didn't know at the time that Bill was going through a divorce and that was probably a big part of it, but he said it got to a point where I had to hire an assistant to convey messages back and forth, and he said in true Hollywood fashion, the assistant that they hired couldn't speak. She was deaf, a deaf mute, and had to use sign language. So he said, so we ended up battling all through this movie. He said, I think Bill just didn't like the way that we were filming it, and then the message and everything. So he said it really kind of came to a crux the day that we were supposed to film what would be the last scene in the movie, which is, you know, Phil Connors waking up, realizing it's a new day, that it's no longer Groundhog Day. And he said, Bill walks on set and he says, how are we going to film this? Shirt or no shirt? And Harold said, well, I think we should do clothes. You know, I think it'll be a better message if you both wake up the next day and you're clothed and you just fell asleep together. He said Bill kind of implied that he thought it should be the other way. And so he said, all right, Bill, I don't want to argue. Let's just have a vote with everybody. So he said we had everybody on the entire production, from catering to makeup, everybody had a say. And it was split right down the middle. And he said it came down to one lonely makeup girl on her very first picture being the deciding vote. And she said, if they wake up with anything other than fully clothed, you ruin the movie. And he said Bill got a big smile on his face, and we all kind of laughed, and that's how we filmed it. But after that, they didn't talk for 20 years. Now, Harold would do a lot of great stuff after. In fact, multiplicity was one of the things he was most proud of, and he would say he just felt like it came out at the wrong time. It came out the summer of Independence Day, these big blockbuster movies, but he said if you watch it and you take it all in, it's a really smart, thoughtful, interesting movie. And he said at one point, he was so dedicated to his family, he told his wife that he would only make things in Chicago until the Analyze This movies came about. They asked him to make the first one. They said, it's going to be Billy Crystal playing a shrink and to some mobster. He said, well, who's the mobster going to be? And I don't know, we'll just throw somebody in there. He said, I told him, well, I promised my wife I'll only make it if it's in Chicago. And they said, nope, they want to make it New York. He said, well, then I can't do it. They said eventually they got Robert De Niro on and came back to me, and so I agreed to do it. And he actually liked doing those movies, but it was sad because, you know, he had been inspired by so many people, and in the end he was an idol to people like Judd Apatow. And so when Judd Apatow made Knocked Up, he cast Harold in it and would ask Harold for tips and pointers and things like that. So it was kind of cool to see that the next generation was picking his brain. And it's kind of cool, even though I don't really like the new Ghostbusters movies, I like the fact that they're keeping them alive and keeping him in each of the stories in some way, reverting back to him. And that's the way it should be. I feel like if they're gonna keep that franchise alive, because when they made the first one, they all agreed they were never gonna make a sequel. And then when they made the sequel, they were like, okay, nothing after this, nothing. So, really sad, really sad. He was a good guy, tremendous talent, and died way too soon.
One of the things that I actually think of Harold for, not only was he a wonderful writer, director, but he was a very good actor. Stripes is absolutely wonderful, and it just made me think of the movie Airheads. He plays an undercover cop, and he's going to talk with the three musicians who held up the radio station, and they're asking him questions, and they can kind of sniff out right away that this guy is not legit, because he says, I want to make you guys as big as Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. And then they end up asking him a now kind of very quotable line, who would win in a battle, Lemmy or God? And then he says, Lemmy. And then Steve Buscemi says, wrong, Lemmy is God. Great, nice. Great moment. And that was him.
The only thing that I wish he could have done that he didn't get to do was, and it's been I think 8 different incarnations of people that were gonna make the movie, and people they cast, and it still has never come out in, I wanna say 40 years. Confederacy of Dunces, Harold Ramis was going to make with John Belushi, and it ended up getting scrapped, not because of Belushi's death or anything, but it ended up getting scrapped. And ever since then, I've heard of everybody from Zach Galifianakis to Will Ferrell to Bill Murray, all kinds of people that they had signed on to make the movie, and then something always happens where they end up canceling it and not making the movie. So rest in peace, Harold Ramis. I love everything he did. Caddyshack, Animal House, all the big ones, but to me, I have to say Groundhog Day was my favorite. And interestingly enough, for as hard of a movie as that was to make, in the end, Bill Murray, when it came out, would not go see it. In fact, when they would interview him and say, have you seen the movie yet? He said, no, I haven't had time. He eventually did see it, and he said, not only did he love it, but he said he thought that the writer had his hand touched by God with that script. And when they made a Broadway musical of it, Bill Murray was there in attendance the very first night and several nights after. So I guess Harold Ramis did have a lasting impact on Bill. Rest in peace, Harold. Thank you everyone for watching. Wanted to come and visit him for quite a while, but I didn't want to do it without Katie because he was such an integral part in our childhood and everything, but we finally got to do it today. I want to thank everyone for watching. Thank you, Tim McDonald, for becoming my newest Patreon. From Chicago, Illinois, go out and watch some Harold Ramis. However you choose to see him, go watch him. Have a great night, and goodbye.